Most people who start learning a new language quickly realize something interesting. You might feel confident in one area, but in another area you struggle a lot. Maybe you can understand many things when someone speaks, but when it's your turn to talk, suddenly the words disappear from your mind. Or maybe you can read quite comfortably, but writing even a simple sentence feels difficult. If you've ever experienced this, you're not alone. When we talk about language learning, there are usually 4 main skills that everyone mentions. If you're learning English, you've probably already heard about them. Those 4 skills are reading, writing, listening, and speaking. These abilities together make up what we call language proficiency. However, one important thing that many learners don't realize at first is that these skills rarely develop at the same speed. In other words, your listening might become strong much faster than your speaking, or your reading might be better than your writing. For some learners, they can understand a lot of English when they hear it, but they feel nervous or slow when they try to speak. Other learners might be able to communicate verbally, but writing an email or a paragraph can be very challenging. So these 4 skills are connected, but they are not exactly the same thing. They influence each other, but each one requires its own kind of practice. Because of that, I want to spend some time talking about these skills and why each of them matter when you're learning a language like English. In this video, I'll go through them and explain why they're important and how practicing each one can help you improve overall. Also, before we continue, if you enjoy content like this and want to keep improving your English, make sure you turn on the notification bell so you don't miss future videos. I upload regularly and there's always more practice waiting for you. Alright, let's start by talking about reading. Reading is often one of the least popular skills among language learners. If we're honest, reading in general is becoming less common these days. Think about the year we're living in now. Many people spend more time watching videos, scrolling on their phones, or listening to short content instead of sitting down with a book. If people don't read as much in their own native language anymore, then it's very likely that they read even less in a foreign language. That's why many English learners tend to ignore reading practice, or they simply don't prioritize it. But even though it might not be everyone's favorite activity, reading is extremely valuable when it comes to language learning. One of the biggest advantages of reading is how much it helps you build vocabulary. There is an important difference between reading and listening when it comes to learning new words. When you're listening to someone speak, if you hear a word that you don't understand, you have a few options. You could pause the audio, rewind it, and listen again. Maybe the second time you'll catch it. But that process takes effort. Imagine you're listening to an English podcast while driving your car or while doing something else at the same time. In that situation, it's not easy to stop everything just to go back and analyze a word you heard. Many times we listen while multitasking, so we don't always stop to study new vocabulary. Reading works differently. When you're reading and you see a word that you don't recognize, everything becomes much simpler. You can stop immediately, look directly at the word, check how it's spelled, and search for the meaning. The whole process is very quick and straightforward. There's no need to rewind anything or guess the spelling. The word is right in front of you. Another benefit of reading is that it helps you notice grammar patterns more clearly. When you listen, you often absorb patterns naturally without thinking about them too much. You hear a structure many times and eventually it starts to feel normal. But when you read, you actually see the structure visually, which makes it easier to recognize how sentences are formed. Sometimes when I read in another language, I suddenly notice something about the grammar that I never paid attention to before. Seeing it written down can make certain patterns stand out more clearly than just hearing them. Reading also opens the door to a huge amount of information and content. Think about how much knowledge in the world exists in written form. Books, articles, websites, instructions, signs, menus, messages, and so many other things are written. If you cannot read comfortably in a language, then you are missing access to a large portion of that language. For example, when you travel to another country, you'll see signs everywhere. Restaurant menus, street signs, directions, advertisements, and many other things require reading. Being able to understand those written messages makes life much easier. This becomes even more important if the language uses a completely different writing system. Some languages use alphabets that are very different from the Latin alphabet used in English. When learners come from languages like Russian, Chinese, or others with different writing systems, learning the alphabet itself becomes part of the challenge. Because of that difficulty, some learners avoid reading practice. But in my opinion, investing time in learning the writing system and becoming comfortable with reading is definitely worth the effort. It expands your understanding of the language and gives you access to more knowledge and experiences. Now, let's move on to writing. Writing is probably the skill that many language learners practice the least. Unless someone needs English for work, such as writing emails or reports, writing often gets ignored. That's understandable because writing takes time and concentration. You have to think about spelling, grammar, punctuation, and sentence structure. Even I have experienced this myself when learning other languages. For a long time, I didn't practice writing very much, and as a result, my writing ability stayed weak. But when I finally started practicing it more seriously, I noticed improvement quite quickly. Writing gives you a deeper understanding of the language. When you write, you are forced to think carefully about how words are spelled and how sentences are constructed. Sometimes you might think you know how a word is written, but when you actually try to write it, you realize that the spelling is different from what you expected. Through writing, you start to notice how sounds and letters connect with each other in English. You also become more aware of punctuation and grammatical accuracy. All of these details help strengthen your overall knowledge of the language. Another interesting aspect of writing is that written language often includes vocabulary and structures that people don't always use in casual speech. When we talk with friends, our language is usually simple and relaxed. But when we write, especially in more formal situations, we often use slightly different expressions. For example, there are certain words that might sound more natural in writing than in everyday conversation. You might not say them very often when speaking, but they appear regularly in articles, essays, or professional communication. Practicing writing gives you the chance to become familiar with those expressions as well. Writing also creates another way to communicate with people. In today's world, a lot of communication happens through text messages, emails, comments, and online conversations. Being able to express yourself clearly in writing allows you to connect with people, even when you're not speaking directly. Now let's talk about listening, which in my opinion plays a very special role in language learning. Listening comprehension forms the foundation for understanding a language. When you spend a lot of time listening to English, you begin to recognize vocabulary, pronunciation patterns, and grammar structures naturally. The more you listen, the more familiar the language becomes. Improving your listening ability also helps strengthen your other skills. When your vocabulary grows through listening, it becomes easier to read, write, and speak. When you hear grammar structures repeatedly, you start to understand how sentences are formed. I've seen many interesting examples of this. Sometimes I meet learners who tell me that they've never actually had a real conversation in English before. They've spent months or even years mostly listening to podcasts, watching videos, and doing some reading. When they finally start speaking, they are often able to communicate surprisingly well. Even though it's their first conversation, they already understand many words and patterns because they've heard them so many times through listening practice. That strong foundation helps them begin speaking more easily than they expected. From my experience, conversations are much smoother when the learner understands well, even if their speaking isn't perfect. If someone makes grammar mistakes but understands what I'm saying, communication can still flow naturally. But if someone can speak a lot of memorized sentences, yet struggles to understand responses, the conversation becomes much more difficult. Being able to understand others clearly is incredibly powerful when communicating in a foreign language. Speaking well is important, of course, but comprehension is what allows real interaction to happen. However, there is one limitation. If you only focus on listening forever and never practice speaking, eventually you will reach a point where your speaking ability stops improving. Listening builds the foundation, but at some stage you must actively practice speaking in order to develop fluency. And that brings us to the final skill, speaking. Speaking is usually the skill that most learners want the most. When people ask about language ability, they normally say, "What languages do you speak?" Speaking often feels like the ultimate goal. At the same time, it can be the most difficult skill to develop. When you're speaking in real time, you don't have much time to think. You can't pause the conversation to analyze grammar rules or search for words in a dictionary. Everything happens quickly. Because of that, mistakes are unavoidable. When you speak, there's no hiding your errors. But that's completely normal, and it's part of the learning process. Native speakers usually care much more about understanding you than about whether every sentence is perfect. Improving speaking ability requires repetition. You need to actually speak, make mistakes, receive feedback, and try again. Over time, this repeated practice helps you. Most people who start learning a new language quickly realize something interesting. You might feel confident in one area, but in another area, you struggle a lot. Maybe you can understand many things when someone speaks, but when it's your turn to talk, suddenly the words disappear from your mind. Or maybe you can read quite comfortably, but writing even a simple sentence feels difficult. If you've ever experienced this, you're not alone. When we talk about language learning, there are usually 4 main skills that everyone mentions. If you're learning English, you've probably already heard about them. Those 4 skills are reading, writing, listening, and speaking. These abilities together make up what we call language proficiency. However, one important thing that many learners don't realize at first is that these skills rarely develop at the same speed.